What are some bad invasion stories that you can think of?
Independence Day.
I mean, the tactic and their strategy was sound. You set up your battle and you attack all at once. I mean, that was sound. I always think it's funny in Independence Day when they have that B-2 bomber launch that nuke from like 500 feet away
Yeah.
at the alien ship, and I'm like, man, that poor B-2 crew. I mean,
Yeah, that's Soviet strategy.
yeah, it really is. Send in the Tupolovs. We'll overwhelm them. We'll send in 100 Tupolovs, and if 5 of them make it, great. With a crew of 18 each.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military science, science fiction contest. Reaction in the system on fire. Military science fiction contest. Short stories every Wednesday. Military science fiction contest.
Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. We are 4 veterans, although today we're 3, who are crazy enough to become writers, and we're here to talk about what makes great military SF, the greatest niche within a niche of any fiction. More niche than the Coast Guard, more niche than the Space Force, more niche than... what could be more niche than any of those things? The Chemical Corps, maybe? That's pretty niche. On board with us today is Rick Partlow, author of more than 60 novels, including Contact Front and the Drop Trooper series. Jeffrey H. Haskell, author of the Grimm's War series. And I am James S. Aaron, the author of the Aeon 14 Sentience Wars and the Galactic Law series. Between the 3 of us, we bring more than, I guess without Josh, we're at 95 novels. 95 novels written. Most of that, of course, is Rick. More than 30 years of publishing experience and also a whole lot of military experience, officer and enlisted. And we'd probably be retired now if any of us had stuck around. If you like what we're doing, you can join our Discord server.
I would like to point out please point it out. I'd like to point out that I'm at 31 novels. Okay, so I'm no Rick Partlow, but I'm at 31. So
okay,
we have 100 all. We have more than 100 just between the 3 of us.
We do. Okay, yeah, because I'm at 20. So yeah, I'll change that number. The thing is, you say 100, and even that makes folks' eyes glaze over. So anyway, join the Discord.
I'm working on my 69th novel.
69.
And thinking about stopping there. Just
I was going to say,
when people ask, how many books you're at 69, dude.
Good place to retire. All right. Today we're talking about landing on a hostile planet, which is something that can be viewed from a lot of different points. But I think, let's see, who suggested this? Rick, it was your suggestion, right?
Jeff.
Jeff did.
It was me.
Okay. Jeff?
I did it. It was
All
me.
Right. Open us up then, Jeff. Let's talk about what kind of a hostile planet potentially, and then what made you want to talk about this one?
Well, I do in Grimm's War, there's a couple of land on planets that aren't friendly in the sense of the people on the planet will shoot at you. And then there's one where it's land on the planet where if you land wrong, you die. Mm-hmm. And if you stay too long, you die, kind of thing. And then I was reading World War Mars, which is a Rick Partlow novel, his new book from Aethon Books. Really, really good, I might add, where the Russians are attacking the Americans on Mars. And it just got me thinking about different ways you could do it, because he handled it in a way that I wouldn't have. And I really enjoyed the way he handled it. So it got me thinking about landing on, either enemy or neutral planets. How would you land ground forces? What would be the challenges logistically, militaristically, all the other leads, to get from orbit or space to the planet? Also, I'm playing a lot of Helldivers, like a lot of Helldivers. I think I'm at 120 hours. And that's all about, dropping from orbit to the surface.
Well, and Helldivers does the classic
and
kind of Starship Troopers thing, right? Like put them in a big bullet and launch them at the surface.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people think they got the name from ODST, which is the motto of the orbital drop shock troopers from Halo is feet first into hell. And so it's big bullet from orbit in a destroyer, and you get launched down and magically survive somehow.
Mhm.
I'm not saying there wouldn't be some kind of drop trooper type deal, from space. I know Rick does it in drop troopers.
Yeah,
You know.
except they're drop in the sense that they drop from about 400 meters up from a drop ship. They don't drop out of orbit.
I haven't given a lot of. I do have an orbital drop situation in book 5, I think, on Grimm's War, but I have powered armor in Grimm's War, but it's very rare. And it's more of a like a miniature mech suit than it is actual, Starship Troopers style power armor or any of the power armor you see in comic books or movies, but it's not actually a mech either. It's more of a very compact mech suit. And they add a thruster pack to it, and they drop out of orbit onto a really hostile planet at one point, and one of them gets shot down by enemy dropships. So it's fraught with danger.
Mhm.
So that's what got me thinking about the idea. How would you land a lot of troops? I think we can all agree that you wouldn't do it the way they did it in Starship Troopers the movie, which is you pile thousands of soldiers into drop ships, land them on a planet, and have them disembark from the drop ships running and screaming and firing wildly. I think we can all agree that that's not the way to go.
But then we can blow people up spectacularly in a single. I guess if you wanted to do, a stupid assault, that would be a good way to do it. I mean, the thing that I
Make
think
a
a lot of
stupid
people don't think about that I like it when an author gives consideration to it is getting to the planet and the fact that you need to think about that because your enemy can see you coming a long way off. And so how are you going to protect your invading force either, through massive, numbers or through like we were talking about special operations last time, like through a small force that could potentially have cover underneath other things like shipping operations or logistics or something like that. I think you have to give that thought.
You're looking at multiple battles, right? You're
Right.
looking at the battle to get to the star system. You're looking at the battle to control orbit,
Mhm.
and then you're looking at the battle to control landing zone. And depending on the technology, some of those may just never be feasible. I got into a discussion once with somebody on Facebook about how he was convinced that controlling orbit wouldn't affect the ground battle at all. And I'm like, well, I mean, that just sort of depends on what the goal is.
What was the argument
If your
there?
goal is,
That's the whole crux of this.
That's the high
is
ground, right?
what is your goal?
yeah,
I mean, if the thing is though, if your goal is simply to neutralize that planet as a threat, then you could nuclear bomb the heck out of it.
I mean, you don't even nuke it. You can just drop rocks on it.
Yeah, you could drop rocks on it. But if your goal is to preserve the habitat as someplace you can utilize for your own colonists or your own resource management, then you want to keep it usable and you have to take it fairly intact. And maybe you shoot railgun rounds, that take out entire city blocks, but you don't drop rocks that are going to change the weather systems on the planet.
No, you're 100% right, and that was my point is that having control of orbit is like having pinpoint artillery capability. Assuming the ships in orbit have the technology to shoot down to the planet and have the ability to view the planet, because it's not magic. Being in orbit isn't magic. You don't all of a sudden have like, oh, I have 100% real time map of the entire planet now that I'm up here. You're still bound by the laws of physics and optics and things like that.
Kind of change the laws of physics.
You can't.
Weather, where there's cloud cover, I mean,
Right.
It also
Weather-
depends on. It also depends on whether or not the technology in your book has defensive shields.
Right.
Because if the planet's cities have some kind of energy shields, then
that's the whole point of drop troopers, right? In your book series, drop troopers, they land to take out the shields.
Yes, they're not like your classic shields like in Star Trek or Star Wars. They're more based in kind of hand wavy in reality. They're an electromagnetic field. They're
Mhm.
like a big electromagnetic field, and you can pierce that with lasers, because electromagnetic field is not going to stop a laser, but it's enough to deflect railgun rounds or particle beams, plasma, something that's has a charge, an electromagnetic charge would get deflected by these shields. And they do have to wind up going down to take them out in a lot of cases. But you can't do that in the drop trooper universe. You can't have one of those over, for instance,
The entire planet.
no, you can't over the entire. It has to be really close to a power source.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes a fusion reactor dedicated just for this field, and that field would only cover maybe a few city blocks. So it's basically for key like installations, like you'd have a field over your, Imperial headquarters or whatever, but you wouldn't be able to have it over your whole city.
Yeah, I don't have shields in Grimm's War. They have electromagnetic shields in the sense that they use different wavelengths to deflect cosmic and solar radiation from the ships, along with the gravity drives. But there's no shields. I don't do a lot of energy weapons, just because I try to getting around inverse square law is kind of a pain, and the
Well, see, the inverse square law, in my opinion, if you do your technology, if you arrange it just correctly for dramatic license, the inverse square law can force you to have close-up ship battles that are really dramatic and very 18th century wood navy. Because if you have some kind of a shield that can shrug off missiles or railgun rounds, then all you got left are energy weapons, probably lasers that'll go through that shield. And to use those, you're gonna have to get close, which means really, cinematic ships being right next to each other. So I kind of like that.
that would be that's a really cool idea. I might steal that. So what we do is we have quail guns and rail guns and plasma guns and things like that. But the hitting things from orbit, like if you think about like, say you've got a coil gun round that can go 10,000 meters per second, right? Or 10,000 kilometers per second.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. It's not a lot.
10,000 kilometers per second.
It's not a lot in space though, because to go 100,000 kilometers, it's going to take 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And so if you're sitting in high orbit, it's not instant to shoot down to the ground. It's even with a ultra fast coil gun round that's going 10,000 kps. So it's there can be a lot of drama in there too, because if you're supporting ground troops and your troops are calling in for fire, things can happen in that 10 seconds. 10 seconds is forever in a battle.
Mhm.
Well, another thing with ship battles, I don't know if it's as big of a deal when you're shooting at the ground, but if you know that the enemy is shooting railgun rounds at you, something that I have the ships in my books do is they make course corrections every few seconds, laterally.
Serpentine.
Well, no, but they're still going the same direction, but they just
Yeah, they roll
course corrections just because it's to make it harder to actually use railgun rounds until you get real close.
Well, and there's something that my guys do a lot of, which is boxing people in, like getting them to go in a certain direction, to set them up for a big shoot, a kill shot.
Mhm.
And so when you're landing troops on the ground, though, like you have to remember that, like in Grimm's War, they've got the turrets and they've got the main gun. And I did the math on the main gun. It's like dropping a nuke essentially wherever it hits. So it's not like they can use that for close air support. So I've got the drop ships that have the, that fulfill that function with spinning coil guns and rocket pods and missiles and things like that. I've got I mentioned a Marine Expeditionary Force carrier type deal that is just for orbit. You know, like they come in like almost like a Marine carrier. They come in orbit. They've got, you know, air support fighters capable of going. Guppy. We got air support fighters capable of going down from orbit and that kind of thing. But a lot of it all hinges on, do you control orbit? And once you control orbit, how do you get a sufficient number of troops down to the planet? Can you get a sufficient number of troops down to the planet? I remember in the first Gulf War, the idiot general talking about how like this was going to be the war that they were going to win with the fewest amount of troops. And I thought that was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard.
Seems like they keep saying that. But no, I think you're right. And the logistics of getting them down there, how much time do you have to prepare? Like, is there any element of surprise whatsoever? Can you ever even expect that with a sufficient force if you're going to try and seize and hold terrain?
That depends again on your technology. If you have a faster than light drive that pops you out of hyperspace or something like that close to the planet, then you have some sense, you have some surprise. At least maybe you'd only give them an hour, a couple hours worth of warning. But if you have to come through a gate that's like out in the asteroid belt or something, and then you have weeks of travel to get to the planet, well, they're going to be ready for you.
Right. Which again,
or
comes
if you
back
got like
to,
a warp drive that they can detect coming from a long way away, it's still going to have a long time to get ready for you.
Let's assume for the sake of discussion that whoever you are, you've got control of orbit. And you don't have a situation where you can just magically make troops appear ad infinitum. Even under Earth's circumstances today, the most you could get over on a ship would be a few thousand troops. You would need a lot of planes bringing troops over to get a sufficient number of troops over to do like an actual, you know, I mean, Normandy was what 16, 20,000, 25,000. How many people were in Normandy? How many people invaded Normandy? I
More
just
than
realized I
25,000.
only know the casualty numbers. I don't know
Hundreds
the
of
actual
thousands.
numbers.
Hundreds of thousands of people.
yeah, let me,
Americans?
Let me look it up.
I know.
I
I'm
just
looking
realized
up
I
right now.
only know
Casualties.
the casualties. There were 6,000
There were
casualties.
160,000 Allied soldiers.
Yeah, and that was like a bunch of troops, a bunch of
And
ships.
that's just the ground troops. I think that I think we should also assume for this scenario that this is not a situation where you want to just nuke the city.
Yeah, nuke the planet from orbit. Yeah.
No, I think,
to
well,
take
'cause
it intact.
There's a reason you want to seize and hold the planet, right? So the planet needs to have, you know, resources. Like, yeah, this all comes back to kind of Rick's, you know, why are you there? What is your purpose? And then that determines, again, like Jeff trying to sell a political aim of like, we can do this with as few people as possible. You know, I just
Also,
remember,
you have to take into account, do you have your own people down there? Is this like one of your own planets you're retaking, or is it one of theirs? Because that's gonna make a
That
change
changes the game.
too. Yeah.
and then
Like I
what
know
resources you
James
have
and I
on
are
the
working
ground.
on a story where you know, we're looking at like garrison troops who've come in after the fact and are, you know, holding the planet, and like, and how what's that look like? And those same troops probably were involved in taking the planet. And you know, do you want to? It kind of goes back to like the way we fought wars the last, you know, since everything post World War II, which is hard. You know, you want to win the hearts and minds of the locals, or you're just going to do whatever you can do to win, and then you deal with the consequences afterwards. And I think we've seen the disastrous effects of the Hearts and Minds campaign over the last 30 years.
Well, I think that if you do have people on the ground, that the only way you're going to be able to get down there and have any chance of rescuing them alive is you have to somehow get special operations troops down before your invasion.
Right.
And that's part of a couple of my books too, is that if you need to get your own people alive, if there's hostages, basically, you have to get people in there unknown to try to get things ready. So when the invasion troops come, they can't just start killing your hostages.
Or get your special ops people down there ahead of time to take out key anti-air assets, because
that too.
anything coming in from orbit is going to be a sitting duck from missiles,
That too, yes.
guns, and things like that.
Land solidify
that's
your
another set of
intelligence.
challenges. How do you get people down there without them knowing?
Yeah.
That's another technological. In one of my books, they did it really the hard way by basically they mounted a full scale attack on this jump gate where, near the planet. I mean, with, huge bombardment, and they put, ships into it. I mean, and they lost people just so they could create a distraction and have enough crap flying at the planet that they wouldn't notice these stealth pods, drifting down unpowered into orbit and then deorbiting and dropping them on parachutes, just so they could get, a couple dozen people on the planet. They sacrificed as many as they had to in this huge attack. And that's why we would have taken that kind of situation. You'd probably have to be willing to lose a lot of material and possibly people just to get people on the planet.
Yeah, space is big, and it wouldn't be that difficult to come up from a non-ecliptic plane, over the Arctic,
That's if you don't. That's the thing, is how are they getting to the system if they're coming through an established, like?
Yeah, but we're talking about, for the sake of argument, that they've already got control of orbit.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Because we can talk about invading the system.
Yeah, but
how
what
that
I'm saying
works.
is, what I'm saying is that if you have your people on the planet before you get control of orbit, you're going to have somebody down there to make sure that when you're in orbit, they don't just say, "Well, get out of orbit or we'll slaughter your people."
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that would be the thing you'd have to do. But I mean, like, if you're invading a planet, like not a planet that's not yours, if you're invading a hostile planet, then, and you've got control of orbit, what would be some of the things that you would do to land troops on the planet? I know in drop troopers, they do a lot of air defense stuff. You guys lose drop ships as they're going in and things like that.
And later in the war, they start landing commandos basically to take out the air defenses before they.
Yeah, and that seems like that would be the way to go, would be to land commandos, over, and there'd be a bunch of different ways you could do that. You could send in ships over the Arctic, or, I mean, no planet's going to have 100% air defense network. It's not like the United States, where there is no place you could go across the border of the United States and not be in some military radar screen somewhere.
I think you could do that. I mean, if you're invading one of their planets that they're occupied militarily, that they have a presence on, they could set up, detection networks that would make it really hard for you to get in unobserved anywhere.
Well, I think something to think about too.
Well, I mean,
time scale, because if you, like, for instance, if it's happening and like all their air defense systems and their radar systems are awake and alert, but if this is something like with special operations, we're doing a slow, infiltration to solidify intelligence and figure out what the ground actually looks like, people get more complacent the longer you're doing something. And going back to that kind of global war on terrorism scenario, where, if we're infiltrating a local population, you could have people that are I don't know, both sides, you could be working that. If you're working on, like, a week-long time scale, okay, we got to hit it as hard as we can. If we're on a year-long time scale, now we've got a lot more time to sneak under or potentially undermine those local defenses. And so those are things to consider as well, I think, when you're looking at like how, like, what's better for the story. But there's certainly ways you can think of to undermine what would seem like an impermeable protection net.
And you also got to look at the cost of that protection net. I don't think your average colony is going to have the capability to put up a complete blanketed radar system to detect everything coming in. I mean, we don't have that, and we have 7 billion people on this planet. It'd be super easy to land on Earth without being detected.
Well, you could be.
Yeah, but I mean, we're talking about a civilization that has star travel. It's going to be a little more advanced.
Yeah, but radar is still radar, and LiDAR is still LiDAR.
It's not equally distributed. I guess it all comes back to story, but I think about like we could probably
Yeah.
tell where
And
somebody
it
if
depends.
somebody's
It depends
landing.
on
We
if
just
you're.
can we do anything about it?
It depends. It depends on how big the colony is. Is it some little outpost somewhere, or is this like a planet with 3 or 4 billion people and 100 cities on it?
Yeah, but I mean, like, how many? Okay, so going back to like some math here, when I first set up the alliance in Grimm's War, I set up planets, and the planet that has the most people on it was the first planet colonized, and it was colonized with 100 million people. And I did the progression math, and it took like 400 years or 500 years for them to hit a billion people, and then it gets sort of exponential after that. And then, so you're not going to have, depending on how far in the future it is, maybe it's 10,000 years in the future, sure, but like 1,000 years in the
Well,
future.
also, you may not be invading a human colony. So how long have the aliens been around?
Well, yeah, exactly. But I mean, like, depending on how long the colony's been there, you got to take into account the fact that every planet's not gonna be Earth with 7 billion inhabitants,
Right. Yeah.
and 2,000 years to establish a settlement.
Yeah. Like I said, it depends on if you're talking about a small outpost or like some little colony it's only been around 50 years, or if you're talking about one of like the core colonies of this alien empire that's been there hundreds of years.
Right.
What's funny is like the more we talk about it, the more it kind of sounds like exactly like how you would do it today. It's just on a bigger scale. You'd have to land troops ahead of time, clandestinely, to take out key anti-air assets and command and control assets, and then take the battle of the orbit. Take orbit, which would be us taking the air. And then you'd have to land troops, just the same way we would now. Even when you take into account different technology, assuming you're at a level of technology where you have to do any of this, obviously, because if you can Star Trek a la teleport people down, no big deal.
Well, then that's no fun.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
I mean, I
no
think
fun.
that's
you got to keep. In my opinion,
well, that's what I think people got to remember from this conversation is like what the things that we're kind of walking through. I think when you're trying to come up with an interesting, exciting story, you could think of all these easy ways to fix it, but it's all about the problems that your characters have to solve, right? And they're trying to establish a military problem to reach an objective, but there's all the other things that get in the way that make the story interesting. Like I'm thinking about like even if you're trying to take orbit and hold orbit, radiation, solar flares, equipment problems. How is the planet trying to protect itself? Like they could be sending up the same, small operations forces to hit, if you've got some kind of sensor net or, all the different things you could do to make this interesting. That's what it's all about, like even thinking
and also,
about,
if you,
well,
go
no, I was
ahead,
just
James.
thinking about like
You
the
managed
level
to
of
go to another.
technology.
You managed to fly to another solar system, then you
Right.
probably have solved the problem of radiation, solar flares, though.
Well, you would hope, but maybe it's a different, it's a start. I don't know. Like one of the things with aliens, like what was
What if it's a
the,
pulsar?
yeah, I mean, the last, oh shoot, it wasn't Artemis. It was,
Prometheus.
no, the guy that wrote The Martian. I don't know. His last, like, he basically pinned the whole book on the fact
Yeah.
that the aliens didn't think about radiation, and, and so they're like,
Artemis, you're right. Project Artemis, was that what it's called?
no, well, Artemis was the moonshot one. It was the last, crap. Why can't I remember this? Like, but I don't know. It was just like this fundamental thing that like the local, humans think about it all the time because we're squishy, and these,
Talk about Hail Mary.
yeah, Project Hail Mary, that was it. Which if you can get the reader to buy that, that's fine. It's just, but that's the kind of thing I think that you have to figure into your like what problems are you going to put in front of each adversary here, and like the enemy always gets a vote, right? So if you're making an interesting story, I think those are things that you should consider. It's for me, it's the stuff that knowing that you could have the, a plan that looks like it's absolutely going to work, and then as soon as you cross LD, I mean, it's all these other things come into play. That's what makes the story interesting. We just lost Jeff.
Oh, great. Well, for me, I think that the real interesting part of an invasion is what I was saying before. What are you trying to get out of it?
Mm-hmm.
what's your objective? Are you trying to take the planet so you can use it? Are you just trying to isolate the planet so the enemy can't use it? And how big of a loss are you willing to take to get this place? That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Because pretty much if you have the ability to control orbit, that probably means you have not air superiority, but space superiority, which means you're halfway to winning the war as it is.
Mhm.
You're invading their planets, then you're halfway to winning the war. So that comes down to like the war in Asia thing from World War II. We went island hopping to win the war against Japan, but we could just as easily have done what other people suggested and
Go straight to Tokyo.
go straight to just what do you call it? Blockade those islands from getting any supplies, not fight on them, and go straight to Tokyo. That's that you got a strategic decision to make for the people who are fighting in your novel.
That's why it's so important. You have to, like, I think step one would be to decide what they want with this planet. I think that would be the most important thing you could come up with, because one of the things you could also do is you could show, once you have orbit, you could target all the farmlands and obliterate them. Wait 6 months and then land troops. If you control orbit, then they're not going to get any more food, and they're going to run out of food, and they're all going to starve. So I think step one is, what is it you want from this planet? Step two is like, okay, what does the technology allow you to do? And what does their technology prevent you from doing? Because it's all well and good to say, well, I'm going to land troops, but they've got, pinpoint 20-centimeter Gatling lasers that can, stop that. Then you got to figure out, like, well, how do we overcome that?
Right.
So it's really, it's just layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of move and counter move. Not just, I'm landing troops.
Yeah.
Hoorah.
Sweet. What happens a year from now? If that's anything that, global war
And,
Do you have
terror.
ammo? Are there
a
ammo
lot of-
concerns?
A lot of militaries in the real world don't think that far ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing that play out right now in Ukraine.
I mean, yeah, that's a whole other thing too, is like, okay, well, what's your supply lines? What's your logistic? What's your tax policy? No.
Yeah.
Do you have ammo concerns? I got in the book I'm working on right now, it's they've effectively blockaded this invasion force. Like, this invasion force controls the high ground. They've got a battleship in orbit. They control orbit. There's no question about it. But they're not getting any resupplies for the troops on the ground. And their whole entire plan hinged on them getting resupplies. And they lost about half of their supplies on the way down. So it's
Another thing to
like,
consider
actually,
is how robust is your method of production?
Mhm.
Because people seem to make the assumption in a lot of military science fiction that you can just crank out thousands of ships or tens of thousands of ships at will. But how hard is it to make these ships? If they're using some kind of faster than light drive that requires exotic materials, how many of them can you even produce? So
Right.
if you destroy somebody's, like in the beginning of the war that Drop Troopers are part of, one of the first things the enemy does is do a Pearl Harbor type thing and destroy several of our big cruisers and wreck the production facilities for more of them, which forces the Earth to go to a different strategy altogether, where they have like small expendable ships instead of these huge cruisers. And they can't get those cruisers until the end of the war before they have a replacement for it. So if you lose a big ship like that, is that just, oh, well, we lost like a destroyer in World War II? Or is it like, oh, shoot, this is a super carrier and we only have 12 of them and now we only have 11?
Mhm.
It's how big of a thing is that? And that's going to influence whether you come into a system with overwhelming force and try to gain orbit superiority, or you have to do it carefully and do the whole thing with commandos and
I think
smaller
there's got to be
forces. It's
like anything, there's got to be a cost. And I guess if there isn't going to be a cost, if it's just some kind of power fantasy, that's one thing. But to make it like a realistic military story, there should be a cost of some kind. And you're right, that should be a big part of why decisions are made, and helping the reader understand that too. Like that frames the whole story. Um, Trying to think about what other considerations would come in. Like,
Well, I mean, also you got if it's Rick mentioned aliens. If it's an alien planet, like assuming again, making a bunch of assumptions, like you can get there and you can land and stuff like that. If it's hostile to human life, then you've got to deal with the logistics of like how do your people survive on the planet?
yeah,
Yeah, okay, it's great to have armored spacesuits or power armor or whatever, but what do they do when they're not in that power armor? What happens if they don't have the ability to get out of that armor? There's lots of what if there is weather? What if the planet's fine to breathe on, but what if there's weather that is hostile to human life? Like not to go back to Helldivers, but like they have planets where they have like fire tornadoes, and nobody knew that until they landed on the planet and were there for a month. And then all of a sudden fire tornadoes started.
Nobody warned us about the fire tornadoes.
yeah. Like
I
in the
mean, so there's all kinds of monkey wrenches you could throw in that respect too, and make it really interesting for like how would you deal with, I mean, James, you were stationed in the Middle East, right? How'd you deal with the overwhelming heat?
you were just
Being
miserable. I know. Start out at Fort Bliss, where it's hotter in El Paso than it is in Iraq. But no, I mean, people died. People just straight up died. Like if they coming from Germany, that was one thing that nobody expected. There were people who just died in their sleep because they weren't climate adjusted, and that was one of the things about Texas that made El Paso a good place to be stationed, because you were so used to just being hot all the time that it wasn't as much of an adjustment, but units coming from other, like people coming from Fort Drum were hurting, from upstate New York is just completely different than, I don't know. That was, yeah, I think that's a big, the only thing I'll say about
I
that
had
is
friends who said they got on a transport plane in the middle of the night in 29 Palms in the desert and hot, got off the plane supposedly in Iraq, desert and hot. They couldn't tell the difference.
yeah, no, that's what I mean between El Paso. But then one thing too is to remember that deserts get cold, and depending on you could be the time of year you get there, it could be below zero. But one thing I was thinking of in the Expanse, I can't remember which book it is, maybe the third or fourth book, and they land on the planet, and it was kind of irritated me, but when it rained, like these slugs would come out of the ground and start attacking everybody. And I just wanted like a better environmental hazard than slugs. But you could tell that was the whole thing that they had thought of. Like, okay, we're on an alien planet. What other thing can we now throw at our people that are trying to establish a beachhead? But that was the kind of thing where you didn't know that wildlife was there until a certain kind of weather came up, and it gets to an ecological hazard that nobody could have foreseen, or at least in this scenario they didn't foresee when they first got to the planet. So things like
Somebody
that.
watched Riddick.
Yeah, exactly. It
Is
was
that
basically
is that Cibola Burn?
It was. Yeah, I think it was.
It's Cibola Burn, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just like, God, get rid of the slugs.
Well, and another thing we have to consider is what's your rules of engagement in that situation? Because are you allowed to just bombard cities, even if you don't want to make the planet uninhabitable? Are you allowed to bombard cities and kill civilians by the thousands, or are you restricted to military targets and you're forced to go down and root out the enemy street by street because your government will not let you risk killing civilians? That's going to affect how you invade too.
Yeah, the political goals.
I read one of gosh, what are those guys' names? They write the Legionnaire books.
Legionnaire?
Oh, Ansbach and Cole.
Cole and Ansbach.
Yeah.
I read their first Legionnaire book,
Galaxy's Edge.
Galaxy's Edge, and it was pretty good. I enjoyed it. And one of the things that they were dealing with is they were on an alien planet with aliens, and the aliens didn't want them there, but they had subdued the aliens, And half the story was the local aliens, as happened in Afghanistan, the locals being like, oh yeah, the bad guys are over here that you want. And in reality, it was just, you know, competing drug farms pointing at each other, saying those are the enemy.
Well, and that was I think one of the big lessons, like you read all these after action reviews of Afghanistan or Iraq, Afghanistan in particular, but you know, the locals weren't stupid. And there's like a lot of, I think people went in thinking they were simple or whatever. And it turned out that like, no, I have the Americans here. I can use them as a tool against, you know, this existing family that I've wanted to take out forever. So I can take over their lumber business or whatever. And we just weren't equipped to navigate that stuff. Like, you know, you throw some lieutenant or captain into that situation and tell them to manage a village, and nobody trained them to do that. They don't know the, you know, the cultural situation. And that's where I
22
think,
years old, just out of college, you know.
yeah, and they're up against some 60-year-old elder that has been, you know, manipulating people his whole life. But that's where it gets to time scale, you know, like how much, like it's worse really to put somebody, you know, on a 20-year time scale, or even thinking about like the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, where they're not doing it with military force necessarily. They're doing it with economic means to go into a place and like, hey, we'll build you roads, we'll build you dams, but you then need to sign over your resources to us. But we're going to do this on a 20-year time scale, you know, so they could still go, it's still technically sort of an invasion of a hostile place, but it's hostile because of economic reasons. And the, you know, the locals can't even, you know, support themselves in a lot of ways. So those are all
And you
things
could also
that,
have a situation like Germany, like at the end of the war,
Mhm.
like everybody's like, oh, we beat Germany, and you don't really hear a lot about what happened for the 10 years after the end of World War II, where Germans SS were still attacking Americans and Germans, you know, bombing them and doing raids and stuff like that, because it's not like they just gave up because Hitler died.
right. Yep. They just
Well,
transition.
another thing to consider is how alien are the aliens? I mean, are you
Mhm.
going to come into a situation where they would be like the Afghans trying to use you against other people, or are you going to be so different that they don't even, you can't even communicate with them?
Mhm.
I
Can,
think
can
one important thing to not do is to not have a monoculture.
right.
I think it's really important to not have a monoculture, just like it's important not to have a mono weather system on the planet. You know, it's not
Right.
a desert planet. There aren't, I mean, there can be, but you know, you want to use those few and far between, and have a good reason for it. And you shouldn't have like,
Well,
oh,
another thing is if you have a planet that's a desert planet or an ice planet, most of that planet's not going to be inhabitable by people.
Right.
You know, because if it's gone that far over the edge, humans aren't going to be able to live on it, except maybe there might be like an ice planet at the very equator. You can barely live, or a desert planet up at the poles, you can barely live. So having a desert planet like Arrakis, where people are walking out there all over the planet, that's not going to happen.
yeah, so it's important to think about. I think it's really important to think about those things too when you're setting up your
World building.
invasion force.
Yeah.
I think the key lesson here is don't just like, okay, we're invading a planet and throw troops at the planet and think of it as Omaha Beach. You know, you really want to think it through as an author, and you know, think it through the military perspective, think it through the local perspective. If it was your planet being invaded, how would you defend it?
Mhm.
And really give the reader a full experience, because you're also talking about something that should be, in my opinion, the culmination of an entire book. Like the invasion of a planet is a big enough deal that it shouldn't just be like, and then we invaded, and that, you know, the next chapter you've got control of the planet. You know, in World War Mars, like the whole end of the book is, you know, something similar to that. It's one of those epic events you don't want to shortchange yourself on and just ignore or breeze over or whatever, because you're missing out on an opportunity to tell very dramatic, very interesting, very fun stories.
If the planet's big enough, you could have several population centers, and
Right.
you have to get control of every single one of those at a different time. I mean, it's one thing if you're like in some small colony where they only have one real city, but if you have a planet that's like even half of what Earth is, you might have to invade 100 cities before you actually pacify it. It could go on for
yeah,
years.
thousands. Yeah, decades. And I'm thinking about like Halo's Fall of Reach, how they turned that into such a like an emotional event that also had like multiple battles tied into that, and they had set up Reach as, you know, but all those things like turning that into something emotional as well as, you know, multiple steps in the battle.
Reach is just the perfect example of how you tell a story like that and still affect people, you know, a decade after the game came out.
Mhm.
We're still talking about Reach. Yeah, that's yeah, play games like Reach, you know, read stories about invasions, watch movies about invasions, even if it's just to like, okay, this is how you don't do it, you know, and
Well, like,
come up with interesting ways to do it.
What are
like when
some
I
bad-
wrote Drop Trooper in the fourth novel, I had to come up with a reason why invading the homeworld of the enemy wasn't going to take decades, because I didn't
Mhm.
want to write like 3 books about it. So I had given them a culture where their emperor was like a god to them. He was divine. So
Here he
basically,
though.
so basically, we just have to get the emperor. We aren't going to invade every single city. We're going for the capital. We're going to get the emperor. And once the emperor is captured or killed, the resistance is going to be, you know, they're not going to have the will to resist as much as they did before. So that was their strategy. And unless you want to write a book where they spend years pacifying the one planet, then, you know, you can come up with reasons why, you know, this one gambit could win the war for you. But yeah, in real life, if we invaded, for instance, the home islands of Japan, if we'd had to invade those, that would have been, you know, 3 years of fighting to get control of those. And,
Right.
you know, 1 million civilians dead, and you know, maybe hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops dead. So you need to keep that in mind when you're coming up with your military science fiction. Is this the story you want to tell? You know, invasion of Japan, you know, or do you want something that's going to wrap up more like the invasion of Germany, where once Hitler killed himself, you know,
Everything fell apart.
everything
It
fell
kinda quit.
apart.
Yeah. What are some bad, as we kind of wrap up, what are some bad invasion stories that you can think of or that you share as examples that you were not satisfied with?
Um, Independence Day.
I mean, the tactic and their strategy was sound. You set up your battle and you attack all at once. I mean, that was sound. I always think it's funny in Independence Day when they have that B-2 bomber launch that nuke from like 500 feet away
Yeah.
at the alien ship, and I'm like, man, that poor B-2 crew. I mean,
Yeah.
um,
That's Soviet strategy.
yeah, it really is. Send in the Tupolovs.
Yep.
We'll overwhelm them. We'll send in 100 Tupolovs, and if 5 of them make it, great, with a crew of 18 each. But I mean, there is stuff like that. Like the Chinese and the Russians have always been known for, like, well, we can always get more people.
Right.
I would look at movies like Independence Day and look at the criticism of those movies and books to some degree, and avoid those things or change them in such a way that they're interesting. I would say avoid magic solutions, avoid
Avoid drone armies that just fall down once you destroy the mothership.
avoid things that aren't fun or interesting. If you want to have a big epic battle between your elite platoon and the enemy elite platoon, and that's all you want to do, and as soon as that battle's over, the war is over, then you need to set up a society so that they do that kind of honor fighting.
Yeah. I would say that also you need to think of what's important to the reader, because they may not want to read all the down and dirty details of how you invade alien planet. They just may want to read the story of this one guy or this one squad or a squadron or, flotilla or captain or whatever, and what's important in the war to them. Maybe you don't have to describe all of what happens invading that planet in your book. Maybe this is the end of the war for this person, and everything else that happens can be explained in a couple of paragraphs at the end of the book.
Definitely. I mean, if the story is not about the invasion, don't linger on the invasion. Finish the book when the book is over. Don't go on, for sure.
Yeah. I think most
But if
recently
you're
for
talking
me,
about the actual technological challenges of invading a planet, well, yeah, that's just daunting as hell.
Right.
You're invading an alien planet.
the most recent example for me is the Avatar movies. Like, what do you guys think about that? Because I feel like they never set the whatever the aliens up as a viable, like, antagonist against the humans. Because if we have the resource,
I've never watched either of them.
you haven't yet. Oh,
The first one, I really enjoyed the first one. I'm not gonna lie, I really enjoyed the first one. I didn't watch the second one because stories about people's kids have never been interesting to me at all, ever. I don't watch or read books, sequels to movies or books, because I want to read about their kids. I want the stories about the characters that I like. And as soon as I found out that they introduced their kids in the movie, I was just like, I lost all interest. It may be good, I don't know, but I just lost interest in seeing it.
yeah. No, I mean, Avatar felt like well, I don't know. I just felt like they didn't think through any of the things that we're talking about here, as far as, the humans have a whole lot of technical capability to get to this planet, and then the Na'vi are just able to hold them off with bows and arrows. And
Avatar, Return of the Jedi.
yeah,
This
This is all
is with
Vietnam,
wolves.
this is Vietnam allegories by people who have no idea what happened in the Vietnam War.
yeah,
They think, oh, these primitives defeated the U.S. Army. No, the Chinese and Russians sent in buttloads of logistics in places we couldn't get to. And that's
Congress
why
defeated the U.S. Army.
Yes.
yeah. Well, and the Viet Cong
what's his
couldn't
name?
fight.
That reporter.
I mean, the Viet Cong were not
Walter
an
Cronkite.
incapable military at all. So that's another piece.
Walter Cronkite defeated the U.S. Army in Vietnam. If you really want to get onto it.
They had all those. You can't bomb here. You can't attack there. They set it up so that, I mean, we could do a whole discussion on this, but basically they set it up, and maybe this is something worth, in your novel, worth looking at. But basically they set it up so that you could not stop the Viet Cong from getting their supplies. You just had to fight them once they had it.
Yeah. But they're also, I think,
the
Viet Cong-
rule of any fight is to take out the supply chain.
The Viet Cong was destroyed in 1968. We were fighting the MVA after that. And that's who we were trying to keep the supplies from getting to. That was the thing when I say Walter Cronkite. In 1968, in the Tet Offensive, that was the end of the Viet Cong. They were destroyed effectively as a fighting force. And somehow that became a defeat because Walter Cronkite spun it as a defeat, and everybody accepted that. So at a point when North Vietnam was thinking, we've just lost the war, the press gave them the war because, well, we were supposed to have already won, and now they were able to attack on Tet. Well, yeah, they threw everything they had and they lost, and that would have been it. We could have wiped out the NVA.
I mean, technically they did surrender. I mean, and the Paris Accords and all that. It wasn't until a year after the war was over that we lost the war.
Yeah.
Again, and because of politicians. So that's something to think about too. If your military forces invading a planet and the politicians back home are not on board with it, you can forget it working, because no matter how effective your technology is, no matter how effective your military is, don't underestimate the stupidity of a politician to screw it up.
Right.
Well,
Well, a politician will always have different goals than a
That's the whole thing with my Holy War series. It was the same people they're fighting as in Drop Trooper, but it's decades earlier. They attacked us and they took several of our colonies, and we got those colonies back, and then we're like, okay, we're ending the war. But the other side didn't really want to end the war. They were just like, yeah, we're just waiting until we can build up our forces again and attack again. And they did. And there was a second war, and they finally got the political will to go in and, take out their military capability. But in the first war, they were like, hey, we got our stuff back, and it's popular. that we've won now, and we're not gonna devote the millions of people and the trillions of dollars we'd need to invade them because it wouldn't
Kind
be
of-
particularly popular.
Kind of like World War II, right? Like
I was gonna say, World War
you
II
know,
never.
we defeated Germany.
Well, you could just say that World War II didn't end depending on where you were. So, like certain parts of it
In
ended,
World War One,
and World War One, yes, and into World War II, and then like Vietnam was a direct out. I mean,
MacArthur and Patton, you know, their idea was to keep going and fight the Russians and end it, you know, permanently. And that
invading
didn't
Russia
happen.
over land is probably never a good idea.
Probably.
though.
probably not a good idea. But I mean, all the now that we can look back in hindsight and see like wars, things we're fighting today are still direct outcomes of World War II that have just continued. Like no,
No, things we're fighting today are direct outcomes of World War One. The
Yeah.
whole Middle East conflict for the last over 100 years is because of how badly they screwed up after World War One.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have faced any of the stuff we faced in the Middle East if they hadn't basically divided the Middle East into easily rulable little sections after World War One, because the Ottoman Turks fell.
all the Ottoman, yeah,
and like, oh,
Austro-Hungarian
now we
Empire.
control this.
So
Yeah.
all things to consider. All right. Well, I think we've hit an
All
hour.
things to consider next week.
I know, all things to consider next week. Thank you for listening. If you've got ideas about this, we'd love to hear it. So check us out in the Discord. And until next time, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll talk to you later. See ya.
Load up, troopers on a hidden jump gate. Military science fiction podcast.